When Nazi soldiers invaded her homeland in 1941, Zinaida Portnova was just a teenager who, like so many other Soviet youth, was drawn into a nightmare of death and destruction. But her response to this barbarity was different from that of many. As a spectator of an insatiable cruelty that spilled blood on the streets, with brutal executions and whole villages set ablaze, she decided to defy Hitler's men and join the Young Avengers. That innocent girl became the enemy's greatest terror. Bursts of fire, violent explosions, and even poison. Everything was allowed to take revenge on the savage Nazis. There was no room for compassion or remorse. Zinaida had become a symbol of Soviet resistance. For her, every enemy death was a victory on behalf of her people, a bit of justice for the subjugated and destroyed peoples. In this new military history video, we will learn about the life of the young woman who knew how to become a lethal shadow, and her final confrontation against the ruthless Germans. Join us as we delve into another of the brutal chapters of World War II.
La Unión Soviética sufre pérdidas militares catastróficas en las primeras 6 semanas tras el ataque alemán, pero no llega a derrumbarse y hace frente a las fuerzas germanas que aterrorizan a la población local. Entre esta población local hay una adolescente que se hará conocida por resistirse a los ocupantes nazis y matar a más de 100 de ellos. Su nombre es Zinaida Portnova.
Our protagonist was born on February 20th, 1926, in the city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, Russia. She belonged to a working-class family with strong convictions and modest aspirations. The Portnovs were, like many Soviets of the time, faithful to the ideal of collectivity and sacrifice for the common good. Zinaida was an intelligent and curious girl who grew up surrounded by stories of the revolution and the promises of a better future for her country. However, that future would be devastated by the brutality of the Second World War, which would reach her lands in a devastating way. In June 1941, when she was barely 15 years old, she witnessed Operation Barbarossa, which launched millions of Nazi soldiers on Soviet territory, beginning an invasion that quickly became a display of atrocities.
22 de junio de 1941. Con 134 divisiones a plena capacidad de combate y 73 divisiones más para su despliegue detrás del frente, la Alemania nazi, bajo el nombre en clave de Operación Barbarroja, invade la Unión Soviética, su aliada en la guerra contra Polonia. Hitler considera que la invasión forma parte de su plan para dotar a la nación del Lebensraum, espacio vital en alemán, y de una oportunidad para destruir el comunismo, al cual detesta profundamente.
Accounts from German fighters and their allies describe the brutality of the extermination campaign against entire populations in the Soviet Union. As the Wehrmacht and special divisions advanced, clear orders came. Not only were they to defeat the USSR militarily, but anyone who opposed the Third Reich regime to be systematically subdued and eliminated, leaving behind a trail of death, fear, and destruction. Public executions were a recurring spectacle, a deadly warning of what would happen to anyone who resisted. The Nazis would hang those suspected of treason in the center of villages, sometimes leaving them in plain view for days, to spread terror among the inhabitants. The cruelty was so extreme that some parents in the region chose to end their own lives and those of their children to avoid the atrocities they feared they would suffer at the hands of the Germans. In Zinaida's case, her family chose to send her far away from home, to Belarus, where peace could still be found, but not for long.
Fue enviada junto con su hermana pequeña, Galia, a pasar las vacaciones escolares a casa de su abuela, en el pueblo de Sui, situado cerca de la ciudad de Obol, en el norte de Bielorrusia. Pero pronto, la guerra les alcanzó allí. Las fuerzas alemanas tomaron el control de la zona y empezaron a confiscar los bienes de los aldeanos, especialmente alimentos y ganado. Cuando los soldados intentaron quedarse también con el ganado de la familia de Zinaida y la abuela de esta se opuso, la golpearon con dureza.
By August 1941, the quiet village had been transformed into a hell. The Nazi army occupied the entire region. They carried out indiscriminate massacres of civilians, burned down entire villages, and mass deportations to concentration camps. The people lived in a constant state of terror. On Adolf Hitler's express orders, German forces destroyed everything in their path, from bridges and roads to houses and crops, leaving not even working animals behind. Hatred of the Soviets knew no bounds. Shocked by cruelty she had not seen even in her worst nightmares, Zinaida was not intimidated. Deep pain etched itself in her spirit. She was not going to sit idly by in the face of such injustice. Like many teenagers of her time, she felt a burning desire to settle accounts. When she saw the mistreatment her grandmother and all the other villagers had suffered, she decided that she would fight against the Nazi occupiers. She was going to do everything in her power to drive them out of the country, and she soon found a way to carry out her plan. In late 1941, Zinaida Portnova joined the resistance. She came into contact with an underground cell of Soviet partisans, the Young Avengers. They were a group of patriots committed to the defense of the Soviet Union despite their young age. They fought with precarious means, but with indomitable determination. Their mission was to hinder the enemy's operations in any way possible.
Zinaida empezó distribuyendo folletos de propaganda soviética en la Bielorrusia ocupada por los alemanes, recogiendo y escondiendo armas para los soldados soviéticos e informando sobre los movimientos de las tropas alemanas.
The first task had been seemingly simple, as she used her charisma to try to convince more of her compatriots to join the resistance troops. However, as she entered the group, she had to bring out an extraordinary courage. Zinaida was determined to get even deeper into the fight. She began to take part in very risky missions, such as cutting supply lines, sabotaging freight trains, and even carrying out direct attacks on enemy soldiers. She finally got a taste of revenge when Nazi blood began to spill on her hands.
Tras aprender a utilizar armas y explosivos de los miembros más veteranos del grupo, participó en acciones de sabotaje en una bomba, una central eléctrica local y una fábrica de ladrillos, matando a más de 100 soldados alemanes.
Zinaida Portnova had become a fierce killer of Germans. In each of the attacks she carried out, dozens of soldiers of the Third Reich ended up dead. The mutilated corpses were the greatest sign that the Soviet resistance would not give up. However, to achieve this, the life of a partisan was marked by clandestinity, with the danger of capture always present. Faced with the Soviet offensive, Adolf Hitler's forces increased repressive measures. The young woman saw how, one by one, her companions were captured, tortured, and killed in atrocious ways. The Nazis showed no mercy. They subjected their prisoners to extreme beatings and mutilations, seeking to obtain any information so they could crush the resistance. However, none of this could break Zinaida's spirit. Taking advantage of her age, she was given a new and risky mission, infiltrating a military base exclusively intended for German soldiers and officers. The presence of a local teenager working among the servants was an everyday sight for the German troops. But this young girl was not there to serve them. Once inside the lion's den, Zinaida began to do her real work.
En 1943, Zinaida Portnova fue contratada como ayudante de cocina en un comedor para soldados alemanes en Obol. En agosto, mientras preparaba la comida, envenenó los alimentos, provocando que muchos se enfermaran y algunos murieran.
For weeks, Zinaida carried out her poisoning plan in extreme secrecy. But tensions mounted as soldiers began to show strange symptoms and fall ill. Soon, suspicion focused on the kitchen staff, and the young woman was interrogated for the first time. The Nazis wanted answers, and in one chilling moment, they forced her to taste her own food to prove her innocence. With almost inhuman coldness, the partisan ate in front of her would-be executioners, knowing that every bite could kill her.
Como no enfermó inmediatamente, la liberaron. Sin embargo, poco después enfermó y vomitó copiosamente. Aún con esto, consiguió llegar a casa de su abuela, que le dio de beber infusiones de hierbas y suero de leche para sanar. Zinaida salvó su vida.
When she did not return to work the next day, the Germans realized that she was actually the culprit and began to search for her. She knew that she was in great danger, so to avoid the soldiers, she became a scout for the partisan unit named after Kliment Voroshilov, one of the first 5 marshals of the Soviet Union. In a letter sent to her parents that same month, she wrote simply and directly that she was in a resistance unit defeating the Nazis. The young woman had developed incredible abilities to confront the enemy. She managed to go unnoticed and attack at exactly the right moment. Every time she jumped onto the battlefield for a mission, the result meant a hard blow for the troops of the Third Reich.
Whilst acting inside the resistance, Zinaida managed to kill scores of the enemy, which must have filled her with pride when she thought how her grandmother was treated by the Germans.
For months she had been fighting the invaders in different corners of the Soviet Union, but in December 1943, she was sent back to Obol to infiltrate a German garrison and discover the reason for the Young Avengers' recent failures. She was then to locate and contact the surviving members in order to protect them. However, this time luck was not on her side. Someone among the Nazi troops recognized her. He knew she was the young woman who had poisoned her comrades and marked her as a target for the Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, to go after. Dressed as civilians and working undercover, the Nazi force was able to quickly capture her. Thus began her martyrdom. She was taken to an interrogation center specially designed to treat partisans. In these facilities, the young woman was subjected to a hell of torture. The Gestapo used methods of physical and psychological intimidation, from endless beatings to electric shocks, along with deprivation of water and food. The officers wanted Zinaida to reveal the names and locations of her fellow prisoners at all costs. However, she was aware that any word could condemn her group, and she remained silent. The young Soviet woman's will was firm, even when the Nazis used death threats and increasingly sadistic methods to try to break her. During one of these interrogations, in an act of incredible bravery, Zinaida managed to snatch the gun from one of her captors and shoot him, killing him instantly. The sound caused 2 other Germans to arrive on the scene, desperate to know what was happening, and in the midst of the confusion, she managed to shoot them as well. Adrenaline was running through her veins and she quickly looked for a way out. She managed to leave the premises where she was locked up and headed towards the forest. She believed that there she could hide while she thought of a plan to leave the city as soon as possible. But her freedom did not last long. The German soldiers, furious at her audacity, quickly hunted the young woman down and found her near a river. They recaptured her almost immediately, and she was subjected to a round of incredibly savage punishments. If she had been the victim of hell before, this time the cruelty in the Nazi treatment would reach a much worse level.
Fue brutalmente golpeada y torturada durante más de un mes por los alemanes, que intentaban obtener información sobre los partisanos. Le sacaron los ojos, la quemaron con hierros candentes y le clavaron agujas en las uñas. Sin embargo, no reveló nada. Cuando salió del brutal interrogatorio, estaba ciega.
On January 15th, 1944, after long weeks of torture and confinement, the Nazis decided to end Zinaida's life. Without a trial, without a word of mercy, they took her to a frozen forest in Belarus. In the midst of the icy stillness of that lonely corner, she was executed. She died at just 17 years old, in solitude and cold, after having experienced an indescribable horror. The young woman who had resisted until the end was buried in anonymity, without tributes or farewells, becoming one more of the thousands of victims of German cruelty. It was not until long after the war that Zinaida Portnova's story came to light. The testimonies of her surviving companions and the Soviet documentation that was able to be recovered allowed us to reconstruct her heroic and painful journey. In 1958, she was declared a hero of the Soviet Union, and her name was written in the memory of a nation that reveres the bravery of its partisans. Zinaida Portnova became an immortal symbol of Soviet resistance, proof of how, in the midst of the greatest suffering, the human spirit can find the courage to face the darkness. Her story of sacrifice remains a reminder of the horrors of World War II and the courage with which those young people faced Nazi brutality. Now, after learning about the incredible life of this young woman, whose courage allowed her to kill more than 100 of Hitler's soldiers, it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us to the end. We look forward to seeing you again in our next military history video.